Chapter 1. The teacup that waited too long nether barrow was the sort of village that seldom changed. The ivy grew thick on stone walls, the postman still whistled the same tune each morning, and the same 6 church pews were warmed every Sunday by the same 6 pairs of well-polished shoes. But on this particular morning something felt curiously misaligned. Not enough to startle, no, nothing ever startled nether barrow, but enough to make the air feel ever so slightly askew. It was a Tuesday, and at precisely 10:30 Miss Lavinia Pinkerton arrived at the Blue Partridge tea-room. As always, she moved with a kind of brittle dignity, her steps neat and deliberate. She wore her dove-gray gloves freshly cleaned, as was her habit on the first Tuesday of every month, and carried a folded copy of the Times, which she never read beyond the obituaries. A woman of routine and restraint. Inside the tea-room, the air smelled of rosewater polish and fresh scones. Mrs. Dorothy Maple, plump and practical, was behind the counter, counting out sugar cubes with a small silver tongue, humming tunelessly. The Blue Partridge was the only tea-room for 7 miles, and Dorothy ran it with the soft tyranny of a woman who knew everyone's weaknesses, and sweet tooth better than they knew their own. "Good morning, Miss Pinkerton," Dorothy said brightly, glancing up. "Your usual table?" Miss Pinkerton smiled, though the corners of her lips barely moved. "If it's available." Dorothy's brow furrowed slightly. "Should be. But at WASN single quotes T. there, by the corner window where Miss Pinkerton always sat, was a table already laid. A bone china teacup, one of Dorothy's best, rested on the saucer. Steam curled delicately into the morning air, and beside it sat a single custard biscuit, untouched. Lavinia Pinkerton stopped short. She was not a woman prone to dramatics, but she did not move forward either. Her eyes narrowed behind rimless spectacles. "That is peculiar," she said softly. Dorothy hurried out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't serve that," she murmured. "Unless it's Miss Pembroke's," said Lavinia. "Earl Grey, 1 biscuit, no sugar, and a touch of milk. She hasn't come in yet," Dorothy frowned. "And I haven't made a new pot of Earl Grey since just past 9. The teacup was still steaming. Both women looked at it, as if expecting it to explain itself. The bell above the door tinkled. And walked Miss Marple. She was dressed in her usual tweed coat, buttoned all the way up despite the warmish day, and wore a hat that was somewhere between sensible and forgettable. A neat string bag hung from her wrist, and her expression was mild, the way one might appear when stepping back into a well-worn novel. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "My, Dorothy, that scone smell is irresistible today." "Miss Marple," said Lavinia, gesturing faintly to the table. "Do you notice anything amiss?" Miss Marple peered toward the corner. "Ah, a lone teacup with no owner. That is unusual in nether barrow. We are, after all, creatures of habit." "It's Miss Pembroke's tea," Dorothy said. "But she's not arrived, and I didn't make it." Miss Marple moved closer. Her eyes, behind their gentle gaze, scanned everything. The way the chair was pulled out slightly, not enough for someone to have properly sat, but enough to suggest they nearly had. The precise angle of the biscuit, placed by a steady hand. The absence of a lipstick stain on the teacup. She leaned slightly forward. "Coral lipstick," she said. "Pardon?" asked Dorothy. "Miss Pembroke always wears coral lipstick." A little outdated, but she's fond of it. It leaves the faintest trace on porcelain. This cup has none." Lavinia raised her eyebrows. "You notice the shade?" "Well," said Miss Marple with a small smile, "I do knit with her on Thursdays." There was a pause. Outside, the mist rolled softly across the cobblestone street. The hedges of Reverend Grayson's garden, visible through the window, looked unusually blurred. "What do you make of it?" asked Lavinia. Miss Marple tilted her head. "A cup of tea can be many things, Miss Pinkerton. Comfort, habit, even ritual. But an unattended one." She paused. "That usually means someone meant to drink it and didn't?" Dorothy looked nervous now. "You don't suppose she, Vive?" The bell rang again. This time the door opened with more haste. Constable Finch stepped inside, his cheeks flushed. He removed his cap and looked from one woman to the next. "Mrs. Maple," he said grimly. "Miss Pinkerton, Miss Marple." Everyone froze. "Miss Pembroke," he said. "She's been found behind the bakery in the alley." Lavinia stiffened. "Found? What on earth? She's dead." Dorothy let out a faint gasp and steadied herself against the counter. There was a long silence. "She must have been heading here," Lavinia murmured, eyes still on the steaming tea. Miss Marple said nothing. She was now observing the way the cup's handle pointed toward the door. It was slightly turned, ever so slightly. Not the way Dorothy would have said it. Not the way anyone in the tea-room arranged place settings. A trace of haste. A movement not quite completed. Did she drop her things? Asked Miss Marple gently. Finch blinked. "No, ma'am. Handbag was missing. No purse, no gloves." Dorothy looked faintly ill. Who would do such a thing in our village? Miss Marple, without looking up, replied softly, "Oh, Dorothy, people are people, even in our village." She turned and gave a small, steady smile. "May I sit at this table?" "Of course," whispered Dorothy. Miss Marple lowered herself into the seat that had nearly been taken by Miss Pembroke. She rested her gloved hands on the table beside the untouched biscuit. "I always say," she murmured, "that the quietest clues speak the loudest, if only one listens before they vanish with the steam." And then, with no further ceremony, she reached into her string bag and pulled out her knitting needles. "Dorothy, dear," she said, "would you mind terribly bringing me a pot of Darjeeling?" "No milk." Dorothy nodded mutely and moved off. As though in a dream, Constable Finch hesitated, then turned to leave. Lavinia Pinkerton remained where she stood, staring down at the tea that had not been drunk, the chair that had not been sat in, and the biscuit that waited in vain. And Miss Marple, threading a neat loop of yarn over her fingers, simply watched the steam rise. Chapter 2. The village reacts by midday. The news had rippled through Nether Barrow like a stone dropped into still water, silent at first, then unstoppable. Word of Agnes Pembroke's death spread not by official announcement, but through low conversations at garden fences, over steaming kettles, and behind the shelves at Wentworth's grocer's. Each retelling added a new flourish. She had been strangled, stabbed, poisoned, found with a note in her hand, or her coral lipstick smeared across the alley wall like a signature. None of these were true. But in a village like Nether Barrow, truth was often the least urgent priority. Mrs. Weatherby, who ran the post office and had not missed a single funeral in 43 years, declared solemnly that she had always felt Miss Pembroke had, too, tight a mouth to be entirely trustworthy. Mr. Chittle, the butcher, insisted he'd seen a shadow near the bakery just before 10, though when pressed he admitted he hadn't actually looked at the clock. And Mrs. Lavinia Pinkerton, now both aggrieved and slightly flattered to be central to the unfolding drama, had taken it upon herself to recount the story of the mysterious teacup to any ear that would sit still long enough. "I tell you," she said to Mr. Farley, the retired schoolmaster who now sold second-hand books from his garden shed. The tea was still steaming. "If that doesn't suggest foul play, I don't know what does." "Perhaps she forgot it," he said, squinting at a damp copy of Middlemarch. "People don't forget tea," Lavinia replied. "Certainly not Agnes Pembroke." Over at the vicarage, Reverend Grayson was attempting to craft a respectful Sunday sermon on the theme of impermanence, though his wife had warned him not to say the word murder in front of the congregation unless he wanted to lose half the choir. And through it all, Miss Marple remained quietly at her table in the Blue Partridge. She had not moved from her position since Constable Finch delivered the grim news. Her Darjeeling had gone cold, but she didn't mind. Her knitting sat untouched in her lap, one needle half through a pearl stitch. Her gaze remained soft and distant, as if she were reading a story written across the window-pane in mist. Dorothy Maple hovered nervously nearby, clutching a dishcloth with white-knuckled fingers. "You don't think," she whispered, "that someone from here did it?" Miss Marple turned her head slowly. "From Nether Barrow, you mean?" Dorothy nodded. Double quotes well, Miss Marple replied gently. "Where else would they have come from?" Dorothy looked scandalized. But this is a good village. We know everyone." "That," said Miss Marple, folding her hands neatly, "is precisely why someone thought they'd get away with it." She stood then, taking her handbag and knitting. "I think I'll go for a walk. Such a sad day, but fresh air helps one think." "Should you be walking about alone?" Dorothy asked, lowering her voice. "Oh, Dorothy," Miss Marple said kindly, "no one murders an old lady unless she knows too much. And I assure you I know very little so far." She departed with quiet grace, her coat neatly buttoned, her steps unhurried. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly, revealing the patterned stone of the bakery alley where the tragedy had taken place. The police had cordoned it off with a single loop of tape and a posted notice, but no one truly needed to be told to stay away. The air there now felt heavy, as if it were still remembering. Miss Marple did not approach the alley. She merely looked down the narrow lane as she passed, observing the crushed lavender at its entrance and the faint scuff marks along the edge of the wall. Not enough to draw conclusions, not yet. But memory, she had often found, was not exclusive to people. Places remembered things, too, if one paid attention. Her walk took her along the high street, past the haberdashery the bakery now shuttered, and the little iron bench beneath the yew tree where old Mr. Quimby had once carved his initials as a boy, and still sat some afternoons when his knees permitted. Sure enough, he was there now. "Miss Marple," he called, raising a hand. "Come, sit. Come sit." She did. "You heard, I suppose?" he asked, not looking at her. His eyes were on the sparrows flitting between the branches. "Yes," she replied softly. "I was at the Blue Partridge when they told us," he grunted. "Shame. Miss Pembroke was a bit of a cold one, but she minded her business. She did, said Miss Marple, though I always thought she listened more than people realized. Quimby gave a low chuckle. That she did. Had ears sharper than a magpie. Used to say she could hear gossip before it was spoken. Miss Marple smiled. Did she have enemies, do you think? He scratched his chin. Everyone has enemies. Some just don't know it yet. They sat in silence for a while, then, Did you see anyone unusual this morning? Miss Marple asked gently. Quimby shrugged. Saw young Henry from the hardware shop arguing with that Winton girl behind the baker's. Right tense, it was. Really? He nodded. About money, I think, or maybe the baby. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. Miss Winton, she said, the one who helps at the library, that's her. Quiet girl, pretty, the kind men don't always treat wisely. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the far end of the road. Thank you, Mr. Quimby. You've helped more than you know. As she stood to leave, Quimby tilted his head. You think it's someone we know? I always think, Miss Marple said gently, that murders in quiet villages are rarely committed by strangers. That would be too easy. She walked on, not toward home, but toward the library. There were too many ripples in the water now. And Agnes Pembroke, for all her quiet ways and perfect biscuits, had clearly stirred more than tea in her time. Chapter 3. First Suspects. The Netherbarrow Library was a modest building, the sort of place that smelled faintly of old paper, rain-damp, coats and lavender polish. It had 3 reading tables, 2 shelves dedicated entirely to historical romances, and a librarian who believed silence was best enforced with a raised eyebrow rather than any posted sign. Miss Marple entered without ceremony, her steps quiet on the polished wooden floor. The afternoon light slanted in through high mullioned windows, making patterns across the well-thumbed volumes and the dusty rug. At the circulation desk dot at one of the far tables sat a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a neat, sensible bun. Her head was bowed over a stack of returned books, which she was sorting with a practiced rhythm. This was Clara Winton, quiet, dutiful, and by all accounts entirely forgettable in the eyes of the louder villagers, which Miss Marple knew often meant one saw a great deal more than others assumed. Miss Winton, said Miss Marple gently. Clara looked up quickly, her face startled and pale. Oh, Miss Marple. Good afternoon. Forgive me for disturbing you. I shan't stay long. Only I was passing, and I thought I might return that copy of Lady Audley's Secret you lent me last spring. Clara smiled faintly, visibly relaxing. Of course. I'm always glad when someone returns a book without it being overdue or damp. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the slim novel. Quite a dark little tale, don't you think? The hidden identities, the secrets behind lovely faces. Clara nodded. Yes, I suppose the loveliest faces can hide the worst things. Very true, said Miss Marple. She set the book on the desk, and her tone lightened. And how are you keeping? I hear you've been working nearly every day. Clara hesitated. Yes. I've taken on more shifts since Mrs. Dawlish's arthritis flared up. It helps to stay busy. I imagine so, Miss Marple said. Especially now, with all the dreadful talk about poor Miss Pembroke. Clara's fingers stilled when I returned. Book. Yes, it's terrible. Did you know her well? Not really, Clara said. Only to say good morning when she came in for her history books. She liked things about royalty. And wars. She said novels were too sentimental. Miss Marple gave a small chuckle. That does sound like Agnes, and you didn't see her today? Clara looked down. No, why would I? Only that someone saw you near the bakery this morning, with young Henry Cross. There was a pause. Clara's expression didn't change, but her hands closed over the edge of the desk ever so slightly. Oh, she said at last. Yes, we spoke. It wasn't anything. Miss Marple waited, gently silent. We had a disagreement, Clara added. About something personal, Miss Marple nodded slowly. Of course. Well, I shan't pry. But you mustn't let the gossips run away with their own tailies, you know. It's always best to speak first, than be spoken for. Clara looked up at her, eyes wary. Is that a warning? No, my dear, said Miss Marple kindly. Only experience. She smiled, turned, and left the library without another word. Back on the high street, the air was growing heavy. Clouds gathered behind the church steeple. A storm was building, though whether in the sky or in Nether Barrow itself remained uncertain. At the far end of the street, Henry Cross stood outside the hardware shop, rolling a cigarette between his fingers and looking thoroughly miserable. Miss Marple did not approach him yet. She would let him stew a little longer. It was remarkable what people admitted after they'd thought too long about whether or not to lie. Instead, she returned to the Blue Partridge, where Lavinia Pinkerton was waiting at a corner table with what she called her reliable tea, nothing fancy, just strong and scalding, the kind that demanded honesty. Well, Lavinia said as Miss Marple settled in, have you made sense of any of it? Some, said Miss Marple, removing her gloves. Miss Pembroke was not a woman much liked, was she? She was respected. Lavinia replied primly, but not liked. No, Lavinia admitted. She had a sharp tongue and a habit of remembering things people wished forgotten. Old sins, family secrets. She didn't gossip exactly, but she knew. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And did she threaten to share these things? Oh, never. She just had that look, you know, that slight smile that meant she remembered your worst moment even if no one else did. Dangerous, Miss Marple said gently. There was a knock on the tea-room door-frame. Constable Finch entered, looking rumpled and out of his depth. Miss Marple, Miss Pinkerton. Might I have a word? Of course, said Miss Marple. He sat down awkwardly, removing his cap. We've got a few early thoughts, he said. Young Henry Cross is under some suspicion. Was seen arguing with Miss Winton this morning, and he's got no alibi between 10 and 11. Lavinia sniffed. That boy's always had trouble hanging over him like a cloud. Miss Marple didn't reply. She merely sipped her tea. But here's the odd bit, Finch continued. We found Miss Pembroke's handbag in the alley, but the contents were untouched. Purse, keys, everything still there. Then it wasn't robbery, said Lavinia. No. Finch agreed. And her watch had stopped at 10:43, broken face, likely from the fall, which puts time of death right after that. Miss Marple set her teacup down. That's only minutes after her tea was brought to the table, she said softly. Finch nodded. Exactly. That's why we think she might have been lured out. Miss Marple stood slowly. Then I believe it's time I had a little chat with young Henry. Be careful, said Finch. He's a good lad underneath it, but quick-tempered." "Then let's hope," said Miss Marple with a faint smile, "that he's slower." To lie. Chapter 4. A hidden clue. Miss Marple found Henry Cross behind the hardware shop, where he was pretending to sort crates of nails and bolts, but mostly succeeded in rearranging them into different shapes of disorder. His sleeves were rolled up, his hair tousled in the way young men never quite grow out of, and his expression was somewhere between sulky and wary an expression Miss Marple had seen on many boys who didn't yet know the weight of consequence. He noticed her coming and stood straighter. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Henry. A heavy one, isn't it?" she said, glancing at the gathering clouds above. He gave a tight nod. "Bit of thunder earlier, but nothing's come of it yet." "Ah," said Miss Marple, folding her hands before her, much like the village gossip, then loud but inconclusive. Henry let out a strained laugh. "You here to ask me if I killed Miss Pembroke? I rather thought you'd tell me you didn't, before I asked anything at all." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I didn't." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. "But the police have questions. That argument with Miss Winton this morning, for one." His gaze snapped back to her. "That had nothing to do with Agnes." "No?" she asked mildly. "And yet the timing's interesting." He hesitated, then exhaled heavily and rubbed his brow. "She's pregnant." Miss Marple blinked, but her face remained composed. Double quotes. "Ah, and you're not married?" "No, ma'am." "And Miss Pembroke knew?" He nodded slowly. "She saw Clara at the clinic in Fordham last week. Started sniffing around. She cornered me behind the bakery this morning. Said she'd never abide a scandal in a village like this. I told her to mind her own business." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Was she threatening to tell someone?" "She didn't say it out loud, but it's what she did, isn't it?" "She didn't shout, just hinted." "She ruined people in whispers." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did Clara know that Miss Pembroke had confronted you?" "No, I didn't tell her." A pause. "I was going to. Later." Miss Marple looked past him to the small alley behind the bakery. From this angle the back door was visible ajar now, a constable loitering nearby. But something caught her attention. Above the doorframe, just beneath the narrow eaves, was a small iron hook. It was empty, but a thin scrap of clattering, faintly, had snagged on it. Pale like a ribbon, Miss Marple stepped closer, pointing. "Did Miss Pembroke often wear scarves?" Henry frowned. "Yes, always tied under her coat, neat little knots." "Same colors, too, beige or blue?" Miss Marple carefully plucked the fabric from the hook. It was no more than an inch long, but unmistakably silk, torn clean. She struggled, Miss Marple murmured, turning the fragment over in her hand. And someone didn't want her to cry out. Henry looked pale now. "Are you going to give that to the police?" "In time," she replied. "But you see, Henry, I don't think you're the only one who had a secret Miss Pembroke knew." She tucked the cloth carefully into her pocket and gave him a long look. "You didn't kill her," she said gently, "but I believe you may know who did." He blinked. "No, I swear. She held up a hand. "No more now. Let it settle. The truth has a way of showing itself when people stop trying to hide it." Miss Marple turned to leave, but paused. "One last thing, Henry. Did you see anyone?" else near the alley this morning?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Reverend Grayson's wife? She was walking past, looked flustered. I thought maybe she'd seen the argument." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How curious. She told Mrs. Weatherby. She'd been home all morning, nursing a headache." Back on the high street, Miss Marple took her time returning to the Blue Partridge. The sky had darkened now, the clouds pressing low over the rooftops like a held breath. People were walking faster, glancing upward, as if the weather itself had become suspect. Inside the tea room, she found Dorothy Maple refilling the sugar bowls with exaggerated care. Lavinia Pinkerton sat where she always sat, still sipping the same cup of strong tea. "You've been out a good while," Lavinia said, not quite managing to sound casual. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, taking in the air, and a few observations. "About the murder?" "About people," she corrected gently. She removed the bit of silk from her pocket and laid it on the table between them. Dorothy gasped. "Where did you—" "From the alley, caught on a hook. It would have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking for something out of place." Lavinia leaned closer. "Miss Pembroke's?" "Almost certainly." Dorothy looked puzzled. "But—" "The body was found in the alley, not at the door, which means she was pulled back," Miss Marple said. She turned to leave. "Perhaps she said something. Perhaps she saw something." And then she didn't finish the sentence. Lavinia's voice dropped. "Who would do that?" Miss Marple did not answer. She was watching the window again. In the glass, the reflection of the tea room flickered with the oncoming storm. But her gaze was fixed beyond it to the way the church spire cut the gray sky, and to the figure now crossing the square. A woman in a pale green coat, walking briskly with her head bowed, glancing nervously behind her. Mrs. Grayson. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Something was unraveling, and she, more than anyone in Nether Barrow, knew how to follow a thread. Chapter 5. Confrontations and Secrets. The vicarage at Nether Barrow was a gracious house of pale stone, half covered in wisteria, and set back slightly from the road behind a low gate and clipped hedges. It had an air of quiet respectability, nothing showy, of course, but one could not help but notice how well-oiled the hinges were, and how no weed dared disturb the gravel path. Miss Marple approached it without haste. She had watched Mrs. Grayson slip inside only moments earlier, her pale green coat still damp at the hem from the mist. The door had closed too quickly. Now it stood shut again, as polite as a lie. She lifted the brass knocker and tapped it gently. A pause. Then the door opened. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Grayson, blinking as though surprised to see her. She was a trim woman in her mid-50s, with careful hands and careful speech, the sort who served tea with both saucer and napkin, and never raised her voice unless it was part of a hymn. "I do hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple mildly. "Not at all. Please come in." She was led through to the sitting room, where everything had been arranged not just for comfort but for impression. A bowl of polished apples, not one of them touched, a framed embroidery of the Beatitudes, and a single flawless photograph of the Reverend and his wife at their wedding, looking as composed then as they did now. "Do sit down," said Mrs. Grayson, taking the opposite chair. "I assume this is about about Miss Pembroke." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "A most unfortunate business." Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened. I can scarcely believe it. Agnes was not a woman one would call beloved, but she certainly didn't deserve such an end. No, indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, sometimes those who are least beloved are the ones who know too much. A silence followed. Mrs. Grayson's fingers twitched at the hem of her sleeve. What do you mean? Only that Miss Pembroke was known to take an interest in things that weren't her concern. A harmless thing until it isn't, Mrs. Grayson swallowed. Well, I suppose we all do that, don't we, in a village? But not all of us lie about where we were this morning. The color drained slightly from Mrs. Grayson's cheeks. I beg your pardon? Forgive me, said Miss Marple gently. But you told Mrs. Weatherby you were home all morning with a headache. Yet you were seen near the bakery alley at 11:15. Mrs. Grayson stared at her. I stepped out briefly, for air. Into the alley behind the bakery? I know. I walked past it. Only for a moment. I didn't see anything. Miss Marple tilted her head. I wonder, Mrs. Grayson, if you knew something about Miss Pembroke. Something she might have been planning to reveal? Mrs. Grayson stood. She walked to the mantelpiece, where she adjusted a framed psalm as though it were the most important task in the room. Her back remained to Miss Marple. You're mistaken, she said at last. Agnes and I, we hardly spoke. We weren't close. Yet she once served as secretary to your husband, did she not? Mrs. Grayson turned sharply. Briefly, years ago. And she left that position suddenly. I believe she wished for more independent work. She applied at the County Historical Society. Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. People were always most revealing in the silences they tried to fill. Mrs. Grayson's shoulders sank. She returned to her chair, but did not sit. There was an incident, she said quietly. Agnes misunderstood a kindness from my husband. Nothing improper happened, but she became difficult. She implied things. I told her to leave her post before she embarrassed herself. Miss Marple's eyes remained gentle. And now, years later, she was perhaps threatening to revive those implications. She didn't say so, Mrs. Grayson replied quickly. But she looked at me in that way of hers. You know it, I'm sure. I do, said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Grayson sat down again, this time looking older. If she had spread rumors now, my husband's reputation, the parish, everything we've built, and over nothing. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and drew out the scrap of silk she had recovered from the alley hook. Do you recognize this? Mrs. Grayson blinked. That looks like one of Anne's scarves. It was torn from her neck, I believe, when someone pulled her back from the bakery door. She had just ordered her tea. A minute or two later she was dead. A long silence followed. I didn't kill her, Mrs. Grayson whispered. I couldn't, you must believe that. Miss Marple rose gently. I don't yet know who killed her, but I know it was someone she knew. Someone she thought she could threaten without cost. She moved to the door, her voice still soft, but firmer now. I think, Mrs. Grayson, you were not the only one afraid of what Miss Pembroke might say, and fear in villages like ours has a peculiar way of growing in silence. Outside, the storm finally broke. The sky cracked open with a flash of lightning, and rain fell in sheets across the cobblestones. Miss Marple stepped out under her umbrella and made her way steadily back down the lane. She paused at the corner where the alley behind the bakery met the main road. A faint trail of muddy footprints had been mostly washed away by the rain, but not entirely. One led not back toward the street, but sideways toward the lane that passed behind the library, and out to the fields down an unusual escape route, one only someone familiar with Nether Barrow's quieter corners would take. She followed it for a few paces, until the marks vanished into the earth, and in that quiet moment something settled into place in her mind, not a full answer, not yet, but a pattern beginning to form. The threads were still tangled, but she was getting closer. Chapter 6. Another. 'Twas by the next morning the rain had scrubbed Nether Barrow clean of its dust and heat, leaving behind glistening hedgerows and glum expressions. Rain tended to make the village prettier, and its residents more suspicious. The murder of Agnes Pembroke had already dulled the usual rhythms of daily life, but now it sat like a stone in everyone's shoe, uncomfortable, inescapable, and not yet properly explained. Miss Marple, as ever, was up early. She had taken her tea alone in her parlor, gazing out over her small rose garden while reviewing her mental inventory of facts, faces, and phrases. Certain threads had begun to braid themselves together: Henry's confession, Mrs. Grayson's lie, the torn scarf, but there were still knots that resisted loosening. She decided it was time to visit someone who might not yet realize they had something to hide. The County Historical Society sat just outside the village proper, in an old converted stable with high brick walls and mullioned windows that fogged over on damp mornings. Agnes Pembroke had worked here for the past 6 years, cataloging letters, receipts, and personal journals donated by local families, work she claimed to love for its quiet usefulness. Miss Marple arrived just before 10, finding the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and mildew. The front room was dimly lit, filled with shelves of thin files and hand-labeled boxes. Behind the desk sat Mr. Simon Edgeworth, the Society's part-time curator and full-time worrier. He was a lanky, sandy-haired man in his 40s who wore elbow patches on his cardigans unironically. He looked up with startled politeness. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. Can I help you?" "I do hope so," she said, stepping in. "I won't keep you long. I've come about Agnes Pembroke." His face paled instantly. "Yes, tragic, truly tragic. You worked with her quite closely, didn't you?" "Well, yes. She was quite thorough, organized, a little sharp sometimes, but respected," Miss Marple offered. Yes, of course." Miss Marple glanced around. She mentioned once, in passing, that she was working on something rather delicate, a collection of letters that might ruffle local feathers, I believe she said. Simon fidgeted with a paperweight. "Ah, well, yes, there was such a set." "Oh?" "A bundle of personal correspondence from the estate of Colonel Melling. Quite old, some from the 1920s and 30s. Private letters exchanged between him and a woman from the village." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Was this woman married?" Simon coughed. "Yes, that was the delicate part." "Was there anything, shall I say scandalous?" Simon hesitated. "Only that the woman in question had a child during the time of the letters. The implication being, well, that the colonel may have been the father." "And who was the woman?" He looked uncomfortable. "I'm not sure I should say, but if Agnes had begun hinting at it publicly," Simon sighed. The name was Finch. That is, Mrs. Margaret Finch? Miss Marple blinked. The constable's mother? Yes. There was a long pause. And Agnes knew this? She was the one who uncovered it. She was very pleased with herself, I think. She said it would make people sit up straighter at the next parish council meeting. But I warned her not to share it outside the society until we'd verified it properly. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did she share it with anyone? I don't know. She was careful with some things, reckless with others, but she did take the letters home with her. Said she wanted to make notes. Miss Marple's mind was racing now, though her face remained serene. Thank you, Mr. Edgeworth. You've been most helpful. She left him nervously rearranging file folders and made her way straight back to the village. The clouds above were heavy again, the sky the color of pewter. As she passed the bakery still shuttered, a posy of flowers left by the door, she noticed a figure walking quickly along the side road toward the constable's cottage. It was Clara Winton. Miss Marple hesitated, then followed at a discreet distance. The Finch residence was a plain, slate-roofed house near the edge of town. Clara knocked on the door and was admitted immediately. Through the curtained window, Miss Marple glimpsed Constable Finch pacing. His mother, Mrs. Margaret Finch, was seated stiffly in a floral armchair, her face pale and tight. Miss Marple didn't linger. She'd seen enough back in her own parlor. She reviewed everything again, this time aloud, murmuring as she moved slowly about the room. Agnes Pembroke, she said softly, threatened to expose Margaret Finch's long-buried affair, an illegitimate child. Margaret, proud and private, would be desperate to stop such a story from becoming public, and her son, our diligent constable, would be torn between duty and family. She paused, but it wasn't Margaret who confronted Agnes in the alley. Her eyes narrowed. It was someone else who had both access to Agnes's daily habits and reason to silence her now. She moved to her writing desk and pulled out a small notebook. On the first page she wrote 4 names: Clara Winton Henry Cross Mrs. Grayson Constable Finch, but as her pencil hovered she hesitated, then added a 5th name, one that had, until now, seemed peripheral, someone Agnes would never have feared, someone no one in the village would suspect. She circled the name. Then, closing the notebook, she stood and reached for her coat. It was time for Miss Marple to ask one final question, and this time she would not leave until the truth revealed itself. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Final Test. By late afternoon, Nether Barrow had folded into its post-rain hush, the kind of damp quiet where every footstep on the gravel seemed louder, and even the sparrows chirped more cautiously. Miss Marple walked along Church Lane with unhurried precision, the hem of her coat brushing against the tips of wet lavender. Her expression was calm, but her mind moved briskly. She was on her way to the one person she had not yet spoken to properly. Since the murder, the person whose name she had circled in her notebook, Dorothy Maple. The Blue Partridge Tea Room was nearly empty. Only one customer sat by the window, reading a local paper with the dull absorption of someone avoiding conversation. The chairs had been wiped down, the display cakes covered, and Dorothy herself was behind the counter, polishing a sugar spoon. That needed no polishing. Miss Marple entered silently. Dorothy looked up. Miss Marple, back so soon? Shall I put the kettle on again? That would be lovely, said Miss Marple. But perhaps I might sit in the kitchen with you? A quieter cup. Dorothy blinked, hesitated only a second, then nodded. Of course. She led her into the back room where the smell of cardamom and lemon sponge lingered. The table was cluttered with recipe clippings and a half-written list for Sunday's menu. Dorothy busied herself with the kettle. Miss Marple took a seat and folded her hands. I hope you don't mind me asking a few questions. Dorothy paused at the stove. About Agnes, I suppose? Of course. Dorothy sighed. I don't know anything helpful. I've told the constable what I know. I'm sure, Miss Marple said gently, but sometimes it's not about what we know, it's about what we see. Dorothy turned. What do you mean? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The morning of the murder, Agnes came into the tea-room as usual. Her tea was served, or appeared to be. But you said you hadn't made it. And yet it was served in your best china, with her preferred biscuit. That's a great deal of precision. For an accident. Dorothy's hands gripped the edge of the counter. I assumed I had made it. I was distracted. Were you? Miss Marple said kindly. Or were you trying to protect someone? There was silence. The kettle whistled softly. I wasn't, Dorothy said after a long moment. I didn't mean to hide anything. It all happened so fast. The teacup. I didn't put it there. I don't know who did. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It would have been easy enough. Someone who knew Inez's routine. Someone who had access to the back kitchen, perhaps to leave the cup where it would be found, just so. Dorothy didn't respond. And then, Miss Marple continued, after the news broke, the cup was quietly cleared away, wasn't it? Dorothy's eyes filled slightly. It didn't seem right to leave it there. She never came back for it. No, because someone lured her outside, and that tea was never meant to be drunk. It was a decoy, a marker, if you like, a way of placing her in a spot for someone waiting nearby. Dorothy sank into the chair opposite Miss Marple. Her shoulders drooped. I didn't know that, she whispered. I just thought. It was strange, but I was frightened. I thought maybe someone had done something here in the shop. I didn't want people thinking it happened inside. Of course, said Miss Marple. You were protecting your tea-room. Your life. Dorothy nodded, dabbing her eyes with her sleeve. But, Dorothy, Miss Marple said softly, I believe you saw more than you realize. You're always behind the counter. You notice things. Dorothy was quiet. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, there was someone, that morning, just after Agnes walked in. Someone who came through the back door for only a moment. I thought they'd left something. I didn't think much of it then. Who? Dorothy looked up. Her voice was barely audible. Constable Finch. Miss Marple's eyes didn't flicker. Was he in uniform? No, he said he was off duty. Just needed to grab something from the back shelf. I let him. We're always open to the constable. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Did he speak to Agnes? No, at least, I don't think so. He went out the back. I assumed he was in a hurry. Did he take anything? Dorothy hesitated. A brown envelope, I think, from the stack of community flyers, but those are always being moved about. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Dorothy. You've been a great help. Dorothy's brow furrowed. You don't think not Finch? Miss Marple stood slowly. I don't think anything yet, but I do believe that secrets were being traded like coins that morning. some more dangerous than others. Back outside, the clouds had broken once more, allowing brief sunlight to scatter across the rooftops. Miss Marple walked toward the constable's cottage, her expression unreadable. She didn't knock, not yet. Instead, she passed by quietly and turned down the narrow lane behind the church, the lane that led to the old cricket ground where boys once played, where couples once walked, and where, that very morning, something had been found. A scarf. Miss Marple had already seen the piece torn at the bakery, but this one, the rest of it was tucked into the hedgerow here, as though discarded in haste. She picked it up gently. Coral lipstick marked one edge faintly. It had not been left behind by mistake. It had been hidden, and not by Agnes Pembroke. Someone had returned here after the fact. Someone who thought the hedgerow safer than the alley. Miss Marple turned and looked toward the constable's cottage once again. It was time. Chapter 8. The reveal. The constable's cottage was modest and well kept, with hydrangeas blooming thickly along the front path and a crooked welcome mat that looked as though it had never quite decided on a direction. Miss Marple stood before the door a moment longer than necessary, then lifted her hand and knocked. It was Margaret Finch who answered, not her son. She wore a cardigan buttoned all the way to the throat, despite the mild weather, and her hair was coiled so tightly it seemed to pull at her temples. "Oh," she said, her mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile. "Miss Marple, I thought, well, come in, won't you?" "Thank you, Mrs. Finch, just for a moment." Inside, the cottage smelled of lavender polish and boiled vegetables. A tick of a grandfather clock filled the silence. Margaret led her into the sitting-room, where Constable Finch sat in an armchair, elbow on one knee, head resting in his hand. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said. Gently. "No, you're not." "I wanted to return something," she added. From her handbag, she produced the rest of the scarf, Agnes Pembroke's scarf, folded neatly and without ceremony. Margaret Finch paled. Her son stood, slowly, his jaw tight. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In the hedgerow," Miss Marple replied, "along the lane behind the church." It had been deliberately tucked in, hidden. Finch glanced at his mother. Margaret turned away. Miss Marple continued. "Someone went back after the murder, I believe, to dispose of it quietly. The first fragment had torn off in the struggle. This was the rest." Finch sank back into his chair. "You think it was me?" "I think you're a good man," Miss Marple said softly. "And good men are capable of terrible things when trying to protect those they love." He didn't answer, but Margaret stepped forward, her voice brittle. "He didn't do it." Miss Marple looked at her. "No, but he knows who did." Margaret's eyes flashed. "You can't prove anything. I don't need to. I only need to understand." That morning, Miss Pembroke had her usual tea. She was expected to sit at her usual table, but she never did. Why? Finch looked at the carpet. She was asked to step outside. Yes, but not by a stranger. Someone she trusted, someone who knew exactly how to get her attention. Miss Marple paused. She was carrying a brown envelope, wasn't she? Finch nodded slowly. "Yes, I saw her with it." And that envelope contained the letters proving that Margaret Finch had once had a child not by her husband, but by Colonel Melling. Margaret gasped. "How dare you? It's true," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. Read the curator's summary. Agnes found the bundle while cataloging local estate donations. She didn't intend blackmail, but she did intend to tell someone. Finch muttered, "She told me. 2 days before she died. Said I had a right to." "No. And you told your mother." Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. "He came home shaken. Said Agnes had something terrible. I made him explain." Miss Marple sat down carefully. "She threatened your reputation, your family's peace. The truth was a match, and you feared the fire." Margaret turned slowly to her son. "You didn't?" Finch looked up, grief raw on his face. "No, I swear to you. I was furious, but I didn't touch her." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you." Another silence. Then Margaret sank into the nearest chair. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It was me." Finch froze. "Mum?" Miss Marple remained still. "I didn't mean to. I only wanted to stop her. I waited outside the bakery. I thought I could reason with her, beg her not to say anything. But she was so cold. She said she had every right to share the letters, that she ought to." Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "And what did you do?" I grabbed her arm. She pulled away. Her scarf caught on something. She stumbled backward, hit her head. I didn't know she'd—" She stopped. Her breath shook. Finch crossed the room, knelt beside her, took her hands. "I panicked," she whispered. "I dragged her back into the alley. I didn't mean for it to look like that." Miss Marple waited until the silence returned. "I don't think anyone meant for it to happen," she said gently. "But the result is the same." Finch looked up. "What happens now?" "I think you should go to Inspector Hammett, Miss," Marple said softly. "Tell him everything. It's better that he hears it from you." Margaret looked lost. "They'll take me away." "There will be sympathy," Miss Marple said. "You didn't plan it. It was fear. Desperation." "But she was going to ruin us," Margaret murmured. "She wanted people to know." "Miss." Marple stood, slipping her gloves back on. "She wanted the truth. That's not always the same thing." Outside, the evening had come on in shades of silver and lavender. The first stars blinked out behind wisps of retreating cloud. Miss Marple walked slowly down the road, past the bakery, past the tea-room. She paused only once, outside the empty table by the window where Agnes Pembroke had never sat that day. The village would talk. It always did. But in time the details would blur. The motive would soften. The names would fade into the folds of small-town memory. But Miss Marple would remember, and she would write one more entry in her little notebook. Chapter 9. Aftermath. It rained again the next morning, as if the weather, too, needed to wash away what had settled over Nether Barrow. The streets glistened with puddles reflecting blurred cottage roofs, and the church bell rang out beneath a sullen sky. Inside the Blue Partridge tea-room, the usual murmur of voices had returned, though subdued. People spoke quietly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would invite the past back. And Miss Marple sat at her usual table, a modest slice of seed cake before her, a fresh pot of Darjeeling at her elbow. She had been offered the corner seat, once Agnes Pembroke's habitual spot, but had declined with a polite smile. "I think," she'd said gently to Dorothy, It ought to remain vacant for a little while longer, Dorothy agreed. The table near the window sat empty now, not out of fear, but respect. Across the room, Lavinia Pinkerton rustled her newspaper, though she wasn't reading. She watched Miss Marple over the rim of her teacup, then finally stood and crossed the room. "Well," she said as she sat, "it's all quite the thing, isn't it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It's never quite the thing when a village loses its sense of safety, Miss Pinkerton. But yes, it seems the inspector was kind." Lavinia leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I heard they aren't pressing for murder charges." Miss Marple nodded. "They're treating it as manslaughter. Involuntary. There was no premeditation, only panic." "They always say it's panic after the fact," Lavinia sniffed. "Still hard to imagine Margaret Finch, of all people. She always scolded the children for chewing too loudly in church." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but fear can unravel the most tightly stitched of lives, especially when reputation is threatened. Do you think it was wrong of Agnes to bring the letters to light?" Lavinia asked after a pause. "I mean, airing the past that way?" Miss Marple considered this. "Truth can be cruel when delivered without kindness, but secrets have a way of poisoning even the quietest corners. Agnes Pembroke understood that. I believe she thought she was doing the right thing." Lavinia gave a tight nod. "Well, it's over now. I suppose the village will return to normal." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled faintly. "It always returns, but never quite to what it was." Across the square, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Grayson, walked briskly to the church, head held high. She no longer looked over her shoulder. Perhaps Miss Marple thought the storm had passed for her too. Henry Cross had been seen mending the hardware shop's awning that morning. Clara Winton stood beside him, arms folded but not distant. There was something tentative in the way. They glanced at one another, as if the shape of their future might still be redrawn. And Constable Finch? He was not on duty that day. Miss Marple had seen him in the cemetery just after dawn, standing beside a headstone with no name yet carved. Not for Agnes, but for his mother, whose trial now rested with magistrates in Dorchester. He had held a hat in his hands, not wearing it, and let the rain soak his shoulders in silence. Miss Marple had left him alone. Dorothy Maple approached the table now, wiping her hands on her apron. "More tea, Miss Marple?" "No, thank you. Just lovely as it is." Dorothy hesitated. "You never said how you knew." Miss Marple looked up. "About Mrs. Finch?" Dorothy nodded. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It wasn't just the scarf, it was the teacup." Dorothy blinked. "The teacup?" "Yes, you see, someone had placed it exactly as Agnes liked, but the handle was turned slightly to the left. Agnes always turned it right, which meant someone else said it. Someone who thought they knew her habits, but hadn't observed quite closely enough. Someone close, but not quite inside." Dorothy looked stunned. "I never noticed." "That's quite all right," Miss Marple said kindly. "Noticing such things is rather my hobby." She sipped her tea once more, the rain tapping gently against the windows. "I sometimes wonder," she added, "how many other truths lie just out of sight, tucked behind a curtain, folded in a drawer, or lost between the lines of a polite letter. Small things, but deadly when left too long in the dark." Lavinia Pinkerton gave a small shiver. "I don't know how you bear." The village returned to its rhythms. The Sunday choir resumed. Mr. Chittle's sheep wandered back onto the high road more frequently. Mrs. Weatherby declared the spring marmalade a disaster, as she always did. But in the silences, those brief, unnoticed pauses between the striking of the hour and the rustle of a newspaper, there was something else. A knowing. Miss Marple felt it most clearly in the mornings. She would rise, as always at 7, take her tea facing east, then walk slowly to the tea room for her usual at 10:30. She never returned to the corner table where Agnes Pembroke had intended to sit that day. It remained unclaimed for several weeks, as though the village itself were unsure how to fill the space left behind by the dead. But one morning Miss Marple arrived to find a young mother with her son seated there, newcomers, recently moved from the city. They were laughing softly, the boy waving a spoon through the air like a tiny knight. Dorothy served them with a smile. Miss Marple paused in the doorway and nodded, not to them, but to herself. The table had found new occupants. The village was beginning again. That afternoon, back in her parlor, Miss Marple reached for her little notebook. She opened it to the last page, where the case was documented with its tidy bullet points and softly penciled names. She drew a single line beneath the final entry. Then, without hurry, she closed the notebook and tucked it back in its drawer. Outside, the bells of the chapel rang once. She stood. Tomorrow she would walk to the post office. She had letters to send, one to Clara, another to an old friend in St. Mary Mead. But today was still. Today belonged to quiet things. To tea leaves, turned the right way. To truth, spoken gently. To villages, healing, and to a woman who had always known that murder was never about blood, but about what we hide until we can't.